Hello, everybody. I want to talk to you briefly about industrialization and immigration. We already talked a little bit about immigration, but I want to talk about the industrialization side of things. Industrialization during the Gilded Age really takes off, and this is part of what's driving a lot of this immigration. We always think a lot about that it's the Homestead Act or the Transcontinental Railroad or some of these things that were from last week, but the reality is it was America's rapid industrialization, and which meant that many of the immigrants coming to our country actually stayed in the larger cities like New York, Chicago, Boston, some of these areas like this. Okay, so what was this industrialization all about? Many people have argued over who kind of invented the Industrial Revolution. Was it the English? Was it the Germans? Was it the Americans? Or was it some sort of weird combination of all of those things? And I would probably make the case that it was a little bit of everybody. But I will tell you that while the industrialization in England and Germany was very different than industrialization in America. Okay, so in England, they're using coal, they're using steam power, and they're building machines that are designed to make workers more productive. They're designing, for example, a good example of this would be the table saw. The table saw does not replace what a skilled worker, but what it does do, it allows a skilled worker to be more efficient with their time, to be more productive with their time. And so you see power tools coming out of Europe and being imported all around the world. You see this idea of what do we want? If we want to be able to do something, we just want to be able to do it faster. The United States always had a shortage, and we still do, by the way, always had a shortage of skilled workers, especially during this time period. And so industrialization in the United States is going to look very different. They're going to build machines that instead of making workers more efficient and faster, they're going to build machines that basically replace the skilled workers so that they can make do with unskilled workers. In other words, they're going to invent machines like a sewing machine, which I know sewing is a skill, but they're going to invent machines like automatic cigarette rollers. Okay? It doesn't take a lot of skill to press a button, dump, and turn and do whatever it is that they do to invent this machine. And as a result of that, the United States is not going to need the level of skill from their workers that Europe is going to need. All right, so the United States factories can be manned by people who, as long as they understand enough English to follow instructions, and as long as they can be very quickly trained, they're doing a lot of monotonous work, a lot of work that just doesn't really take a lot of mental engagement, just basically back-breaking work. So with that in mind, the kinds of people that the industrialists are looking for is they're looking for kind of the down and out and unskilled immigrants coming from Europe, and they want to be able to read and write, of course, and do some basic mathematics, but for the most part, they just want to be able to follow instructions. Take this machine, pull this wrench, press this button, turn this thing at the right time, and then push it down the line. Do one job and do it well, kind of thing, whereas in Europe, this could be very different. As for the people who are the industrialists, well, they're either robber barons or they're captains of industry. Kind of depends on whether or not you like them. If you don't like them, they're robber barons. You focus on the exploitation of the workers. You focus on the fact that they enriched themselves but really added very little to the society as a whole. Or you could look at them as captains of industry. They were innovators. They took risks and they changed society as a result. And both of those cases are true. I mean, we see this, for example, Henry Ford. Henry Ford is not going to invent the automobile. He's not going to invent the assembly line, but he's going to take those two things together, and then he's going to add this idea of making an assembly line that moves so that we move the vehicle, the car, instead of moving the worker. Because in those days, what would happen is the worker, you walk up to your workstation, unpack your tools, do what you got to do, put everything back in your toolbox, move on to the next station, unpack your tools, do what you got to do, pack your tools again, move on to the next station. And it was used up a lot of time. And so Henry Ford comes in and he moves the block. You stay there all day, turn, 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 and it moves on to the next one, turn, 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 moves on to the next one. And so you're in one place doing the same thing, but it's very fast. Changes production, absolutely. And they're able to produce cars at a rate of about one car every 22 minutes. And it's only going to get faster. You know, and Henry Ford had this idea of that he thought his workers should be able to afford the cars that they're building, that they should be his most loyal customers. And so he paid them higher wages than any other industrialist paid at the time. So in this sense, hey, he's a captain of industry. Look at the great things he's doing. All right. But he was also rabidly anti-Semitic. He hated people of Jewish descent to the point that he actually supported Hitler's rise to power during the 1930s because Hitler hated Jews and Ford hated Jews, so it was a natural combination, even going so far as to sell the Nazis Ford engines for their tanks. He was a rabid anti-union guy who used spies on his own employees to see who was industrializing or who was unionizing and who was talking bad about the company. If you said anything bad about the company, you could be terminated. So he's also that robber baron. Then there's other people. As they start to industrialize, what you see is people starting to do what's called vertical alignment and horizontal alignment. Okay, so real quick about what those two, and give you an example of each one. All right, so horizontal alignment is where a person goes in and they buy out all their competition. Example of that is John D. Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller was America's first billionaire. That's billionaire with the B. Today, if you adjust it for inflation, his personal wealth, not his company, but his personal wealth would be somewhere in the order of twice what Bill Gates is. All right, so it's a couple $100 billion or something like this. All right, he was phenomenally wealthy, and someone once asked him, how much money is enough money? And he said, well, just a little bit more. Well, he got wealthy by buying out. He owned a company called Standard Oil. It's now ExxonMobil. And he got wealthy by buying out all the competition so that he was the only person producing oil in our country. And so he controlled all the oil, all the gasoline. If it came from the ground and was messy and black, he probably controlled it. And so then after that, he could drive the price up. Like, for example, they could actually get the price of gasoline up to 12 cents a gallon. It was scandalous. All right, well, that's an example of horizontal alignment. Horizontal alignment is used just basically so you can control the price. Well, then you also have vertical alignment. Now, vertical alignment is where you control every step along the process. And a good example of this was the guy named Hormel. Hormel was the guy who did famous for canned ham, like chili and Spam and that sort of thing, right? And, well, he wanted to control every part of the production process. So he owned farms that raised pigs. Then he owned the railroad cars that were transporting the pigs. And then when he gets there, he owns the meat packers that are making it into whatever it is that they're making it into. And then afterwards, he owns the glue factory where the hooves and the leftovers are being turned into Elmer's glue. And in other words, he would say nothing is wasted except the squeak. But he controls every part of it. So at no point does any of your wealth go outside your own little personal system. And so this is a really great example of vertical alignment. And some of these guys, these industrialists, they gave a lot to their community. People like Andrew Carnegie, or Carnegie is how he would say it because he was from Scotland. Andrew Carnegie believed in something called the gospel of wealth. He believed that since he was wealthy, he had a responsibility to help lift up people around him. And since he believed in knowledge as being a vehicle to personal growth, he sponsored the New York Public Library, the largest library system in the world. And he sponsored Carnegie Mellon University and several other things that have a close relationship with steel. He believed in putting knowledge in the hands of people who were willing to then work hard to become successful. And he even went so far as to say that any man who dies rich dies ashamed. He was probably close to a billionaire. He's probably worth about $600 million. But he also understood that he was worth that much because he kind of got lucky. He started a steel company called Bethlehem Steel, which right at the time that they were starting to build the Transcontinental Railroad. And they needed all of this steel, and they bought it from him. So he got lucky. And so he believed that his goal was to give away all of his money before he died so that he wouldn't have the shame of dying wealthy. So when people start talking about these industrialists, sometimes they're hard to categorize. People like Carnegie were very generous. People like John D. Rockefeller could be generous. I mean, Rockefeller Plaza, the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art, and then others were just very, very selfish and believed I made my money and you want to make money, go do what I did. And, people like Vanderbilt, for example. Vanderbilt made his money first in steamboats, then in steam locomotives, or those things that run on land, as he called them. And he made all that money, but he was very tight-fisted with it. He felt it was my money, and I'm not going to share it. His granddaughter, by the way, just died a couple of years ago. That was Gloria Vanderbilt, and his great-grandson is on television on one of the television news programs. His last name is Anderson. And so his family's still alive, and they are very, very wealthy as a result of this, not sharing the wealth outside the family. So industrialization in our country, like I said, and we're not going to be the only ones that produce some very wealthy people, of course not. But in the United States, that industrialization, for those who took the risks, or were lucky, or a little bit of both, industrialization could make you really, really wealthy. But once again, there's still kind of this underlying exploitation, this underlying dark side of industrialization that is always lurking just beneath the pretty surface, even for the most well-respected captain of industry. All right, so I'll talk to you later. Until then, have a great evening.